This is an old hammer that belonged to my friend's grandfather. We restored it by taking the rust off and making a new grip from stacked leather. The hammer was found without the original grip, which saved us some time from having to cut it off. The first thing we did was remove the grip plate. We found that a grinding bit on a Dremel tool worked the best, with the least amount of damage to the plate. We didn't want to take too much off because we wanted to be able to fit it back on for our future measurements. We then obtained a roll of scrap leather that would be used to fashion a new grip. I found a piece of flat metal that had a perfect measurement for the narrow side of the handle. I used it as a pattern to draw my line. I then cut out this strip using a bandsaw. Next, the wide side of the handle was measured out on the leather. I found that the wide end of a framing square was a perfect pattern for this side. The pieces were then marked along the strip for cutting. Once again, the leather was cut using a bandsaw. Once cut, the pieces were gathered and dry stacked in order to compare the amount with the length of the handle. Once satisfied with the amount we cut, we marked the center by striking an X on each piece. A slot will have to be cut in order to slide the individual pieces onto the handle. I found that one of my wood chisels was the perfect width to mark the slot. We then used a leather punch to create the slot by making a series of 3 holes along the chisel mark. The pieces were tested on the handle to make sure they were going to have a snug fit. Now that we had our pieces, the hammer and plate could be cleaned. This was done by soaking them in a rust removal agent and then scrubbed with a wire brush. Medium to light rust will be dissolved in 30 minutes or less, while heavier rust may require a second application. With the help of a wire wheel on my drill press, we continued the rust removal process. We then switched to an abrasive wheel and finished off using fine grit sandpaper. Next, we made a design for the grip by drawing out the size and shape on some cardboard. One pattern for the narrow side of the handle, and one pattern for the wide side of the handle. These patterns will be set aside until the grip has been assembled. Using painter's tape, we taped off the neck and head of the hammer. This is to protect it from misplaced epoxy when we later assemble the grip. The leather pieces and epoxy materials were organized for easy assembly. Since we are using a 30-minute epoxy, we didn't want to waste any time. Using a disposable clean bowl, we mixed the epoxy very well. The epoxy was applied to one side of each leather piece and then slid onto the handle. We continued this until the whole handle was filled and the pieces were square with each other. The pieces were then compressed together by weighing it down in a vise and clamping it in pressed position. We allowed 24 hours to make sure the epoxy was cured. The next day, starting with the narrow side, the pattern was traced onto the leather. Using the bandsaw, shaping began by cutting along the marked lines that we made from the pattern. The rough cut was now done on the narrow side of the handle. We then repeated this process on the wide side of the handle by tracing out the wide side pattern and then returning it to the bandsaw for cutting along the marked lines. At this point, the bulk of the material has been removed. The rest of the shaping was done slowly and patiently by shaving the corners and trimming the ends with the saw. Once the rough cuts were done, the handle was shaped further with the use of a drum sander on my drill press. This proved to be the most useful tool for rounding the handle and trimming the leather flush with the ends. We started with 50 to 80 grit sanding drums and ended with finer grit as we got closer to the desired shape. The final shaping was done using a series of sandpaper, once again going from coarse to fine grit. We then finished off by wetting the handle and sanding with 600 grit sandpaper. Next, we installed the grip plate. The plate is secured in place by placing it over the two posts on the end of the handle, and then peen with a hammer to mushroom the ends. Since the posts were a little too long, we used a bench grinder to form the ends down for the best fit. While the metal was still hot from the grinding, we used a large hammer to peen and mushroom the ends. This was done until the plate was tightly secured. Finally, the grip was treated with neatsfoot oil in order to condition and preserve the leather. A soft rag was then used to buff to a non-oily finish. And the end product is a beautiful restored hammer.